Okay, so this bit of the chapter, our mission and vision chapter, deals with stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. So, to review from our very first chapter of the textbook, chapter 1, remember we defined stakeholders when we talked about the triple bottom line. So, back then in chapter 1, we said that stakeholders are those individuals or groups or entities who are either actively involved in the organization or whose interests may be affected as a result of what the organization does. So, a stakeholder is somebody who's involved with the organization or that is impacted by the decisions that an organization makes. So, they might not actually be involved with the organization, but still feel some consequences, positive or negative, from the organization's decisions. So, I put a question up here for you. You might think about what these different types of stakeholders may be. Who are they? Who are the different individuals? Who are the different groups who are either impacted by a decision or actually involved in the organization? So, what we're doing is we're gonna take a look at the stakeholder analysis, and then we're gonna map stakeholders and their level of participation on the next slide. So just a couple of slides for this short video right here. So what is a stakeholder analysis? Stakeholder analysis is a management tool that we can use in our company to identify and to understand the needs and expectations that of those individuals or groups that have some major interests or are impacted by us. And these stakeholders may be inside the company, right? Inside the organization, or also within the environment of the organization, meaning external to the company. So when we develop mission and vision statements, which is what this chapter is about, we want to clarify the organization's larger purpose. That's what we are doing with the mission and vision development process. And we want to make sure that we meet or exceed the need of our key stakeholders, right? So maybe everybody globally would be impacted by us somehow, but we cannot consider every single stakeholder that exists on this globe. So that would be quite too overwhelming and we wouldn't have the resources to deal with that. So instead, who are the key stakeholders? So the stakeholder analysis then lets us look at those parties, individuals or groups that may prevent our strategy from being executed, might hurt the organization. It can be local, state, can be national, can even be foreign. Internal or external actors. And for these reasons, the stakeholder analysis then is super important. We have to make sure that we do stakeholder analysis so that we can then ultimately implement our strategy in a most successful way. So we might use something like you see on the right side of the slide here for identifying stakeholders and plotting them on something called the power versus interest dimension, right? So we can talk about the extent of power from low all the way up to high, and then at the same time their interest in what we're doing as an organization from low all the way up to high. So if you are in a situation where you have low power and low interest groups, you might just want to keep an eye on them. Up here, where you're high, this is a stakeholder with lots of power, and they are very interested in the organization, in its decisions, and in the consequences that come from this organization's decisions. You want to manage closely. You want to make sure that you're meeting, exceeding their needs, and take that into consideration. On the power spectrum, but not maybe as interested, you might want to keep these satisfied to make sure that they are okay with what is going on. And on the high interest with low power, you're keeping them informed about what is going on. All right, so stakeholder mapping. We are looking at two big dimensions here, right? So similar to what we saw on the previous slide. We are talking about the influence. Let me find my pen again. We'll do a red one on this slide. The influence of the stakeholder, meaning the relative power they have over the organization's action. And then we also have the importance. As I said on the prior slide, there might be numerous stakeholders within the organization as well as outside of the organization, but it would be impossible for the company, the enterprise, to consider every single stakeholder. So what is the importance of the stakeholder to the organization? So we have 3 steps in identifying the stakeholders. The first one being determining the influences of the stakeholder on mission, vision, and strategy formulation. So one way to think about how important the different individuals or groups are that is a stakeholder or could be a stakeholder is to think about the impact that they would have on our strategy. So these would be the groups or individuals that we should consult, right? We haven't talked about strategy development yet. That will come in chapter 5. But when you're doing strategy development, when you are writing a company strategy or coming up with a company strategy, you want to make sure that you talk to people that are impacted. You want to talk to the stakeholders. So that's what we're doing here. We are identifying those individuals that have input to give us for our mission, vision, and strategy formulation. So there's lots of different stakeholders, and your textbook talks about 4 different types. They talk about organizational, capital market, product market, and social stakeholders. So make sure you go to the chapter and look at those 4. Organizational stakeholders, you know who those are, right? These are the employees, all the way from the top of the organization, the executive, to those who work the frontline workers. Capital market stakeholders are those that supply money to the organization. Who funds the company? Are these shareholders? Are they, angel investors, venture capitalists, banks? Who are they? So capital market stakeholders provide the financial resources to an organization. Then we have something called product market stakeholders. They are anybody with whom the firm share in industry, maybe suppliers and customers, so in the product market. Social stakeholders is the last group, generally external groups, organizations that have or tend to be impacted by the organization and how the organization does. Maybe unions, maybe activist groups, maybe the community, maybe the kids who live there, maybe government. So those are the social stakeholders. So that's step number 1. And then step number 2 is to determine the effects of the decisions that we take on the stakeholder. So here we determine the nature of the effect of the firm's strategic decisions on these key stakeholders that we have identified. Because if you think about it, not every stakeholder is going to be affected in exactly the same way by the decisions that we make as a company, right? It depends on who you are. It depends on who the stakeholder is. So some of these effects or consequences tend to be mild. Doesn't really matter whether they're positive or negative. They might just have a minimal impact on the group or individual. But at the other end of this range, some stakeholders have or may be greatly affected or impacted, either in a good sense or in a negative sense, by a company's decisions. So we're determining here the stakeholders who are the most important based on the strategy and how our strategy would impact these stakeholders. The third and final step is to determine their power and their influence over our decisions, right? So power and influence sort of go together. So this analysis is to determine the degree to which these groups and individuals, our stakeholders, have some sort of power or influence over the decisions that we make. Do they perhaps have direct control over what we want to decide? Maybe they have veto power, maybe they can vote on us. Maybe they are just annoying, so they don't really have an impact on our decisions, but they're making a lot of noise. Or maybe they have no influence whatsoever. So recognize that even though the degree to which a stakeholder can be impacted by our decisions is sometimes very, very correlated, highly correlated or associated with their power and influence, this is not always the case. Sometimes somebody with a lot of power and influence may not be affected at all, and vice versa. For instance, think about it. In a big company, you have a lot of frontline employees that are producing products or they are providing services. So they are highly impacted by big decisions on layoffs or reorganizations or mergers and acquisitions that the organization is doing, but they literally have no say in those decisions. So there is not necessarily a one-to-one there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between amount of power and influence and being impacted by the decision. So your book again talks about different types of power, and you might want to take a look at those. So we have the formal voting power is one. This would be sort of the owners of the company or boards of directors. They have formal voting power. There's also economic power. These might be groups like suppliers or banks or unions that have some sort of economic, financial, monetary, or otherwise economic power over the organization and its decisions. And lastly is political power. So action groups or government, new legislation coming through, maybe shareholders that are unhappy might cause ruckus and start a rebellion to take over the company because they don't agree with the way it's being managed. A lot of different ways of doing that. So different types of power, just to recap and summarize: formal voting power, economic power, and political power. And that's going to wrap it for the discussion on stakeholders with relation to mission and vision.